Statutes of Life, Part 3. I'm Jodelle Onstadt. Welcome to episode 127 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I am glad that you are with me this morning. We have a lot to cover today, and we are going to be taking this in several different directions. So I am going to try to pack in a lot of information in this episode, and I'll cover it from different angles because of the modern world we are in today and the different issues that we have at play. There are several ways in which we can look at this text and go through this information for better understanding, and hopefully also address some modern scholarship and modern controversies regarding the text, because that's kind of where I see this series going. I see this series on the Statutes of Life kind of evolving into some textual analysis as we continue on. But I want to lay that foundation. We're going to start with the actual statutes. We're going to look at those statutes. But today we're going to begin just in the back of our mind, keep it in our forefront, ideas of modern scholarship, ideas of Torah authorship, because there's a lot of controversies and it has proved very divisive. When we go to the schools, the major schools that publish scholarship, academic scholarship, you have three basic schools today. You have the German school, the American school, and the Hebrew school. Those scholarship coming out of Israel, whether it's Haifa, Jerusalem, but that scholarship. And I am going to say that I am finding the scholarship that's coming out of Israel far more compelling than the scholarship in America or Germany or Europe per se. So we're going to look at these ideas as we kind of merge all these concepts together. So this morning, I want to kind of pick up where we left off in our last episode, which is Exodus 15, 25, and 26. So turn with me there for a minute. And this is what the text says. There he made for them a statute and a judgment, and there he tested them. This is referring to Yahweh. And he said, if you will earnestly listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, to do what is right in his sight, to give ear to his commandments and his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you that I have put upon the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh your healer. There are several things to note in this text. Number one, this incident of Marah, the bitter waters of Marah, becomes a statute and a judgment. So as we read through the text, or as you read through the Torah on your own, ask yourself, what of these statutes may derive from Marah? What are these are tests that are put before to test our obedience? Notice that it says that Moses and Yahweh tested and proved Israel at the waters of Marah. This was a test of obedience. And there we could find actually some of the statutes within the law may be there simply to test our obedience. Are we willing to obey? Words is cheap, talk are cheap, but action reveals your heart. You can fake it, something that you don't really believe in for, maybe a couple times, maybe 3 or 4 times. If you're really trying hard, maybe 8 times. But it doesn't become a way of life. It doesn't become innate to you unless you really believe it. Then all of a sudden that is going to become a philosophical, preceptual foundation that is going to govern the choices that you make. It becomes a part of you. It's in your heart. It says a fault between your eyes. It's in your heart, in your minds. It's upon your hands because you think, you act, and you do, and you live according to that law. It becomes very holistic. So that is the premises. That's kind of the foundation that we are building off of as we look at these statutes and judgments. Now, one of the controversies that I also frequently come across in discussions regarding the Torah is the Torah simply a teaching or is it a law? And what this question often implies is that if the Torah is a teaching, which it does talk many, many times about the Torah being a teaching, then it's not a law, as though they are somehow mutually exclusive. And there's the idea that if it's just meant to be a philosophical teaching, then there's no absolute boundaries to it. There's no ending to it. It's malleable. Later generations, later people can come in and they can adapt it at will, ad hoc, and make it their own, may even say things completely contradictory to what the text actually states. So this is a very important question that it's important that we resolve before we get into the exact statutes and judgments that we're going to look at today. So one of the philosophies that you have with law, and this is going to be a national law code, whether it's the U.S. Constitution, whether it's the laws of Europe, Hammurabi Code, Assyrian, Middle Assyrian laws, Hittite laws, it doesn't matter. The overarching idea of any legal code is that it establishes ideas and values of right and wrong for society. That is the legal precedent. So in America or in Scripture, the Ten Commandments, where we have laws against killing, well, those laws against killing are there because killing is wrong. Same with theft. Those laws are there because not only does it establish a cohesive and a society without chaos where there's consequences and those consequences prevent you from just, oh, I want it. I'm stronger. I have more power. Maybe my family has a standing army. Let me go take it from those that are weaker. Or let me exploit them, force them into slavery to work for me and my family, my kinsmen, because we're the stronger of the families. Those types of things, the law limits the type of power. Theoretically, it would also do that with corporations that we have in the United States, where the power of corporations is curbed. And they just can't do it because they have the most power and the most money, but rather there's a rule of law that they have to adhere to and they have to abide by. So with this, just, if you will, just consider this concept that law itself is always tied to some sort of morality and a concept of right and wrong. The Torah, this is especially true, the written Torah. So is the written Torah a law or a teaching? Well, it is actually both. It is foremost a written law that cannot be changed. You can't add to it, can't take away from it. Deuteronomy 4:2, 12:32. So it's in stone. But it's a living law in the fact that it should be applied to new situations or as new instances arrive that couldn't be considered in the Torah. That doesn't mean it changes. It doesn't mean that, it's just constantly evolving, but rather the precepts upon which those statutes and judgments are written should be applied to modern situations. And I think that the reason that this has become such an issue today is because we really don't take this Torah seriously. In thinking that it's open-ended and it can be constantly tweaked to our own values and sensitivities, we fail that test. We fail the test of, none of these diseases, where if we're constantly updating it to our own values and sensitivities, we fail in those precepts. So we have to be very exact with how we view a very written law, a law in stone that's black and white, that you don't add to and take away from, versus applying it to modern situations. I've used this example often in the past. The Torah has stipulations in Deuteronomy 22, verse 8, about constructing a fence around, or a parapet around the border of your roof. ancient Israel had roofs where they often formed highways and roads that would actually you would go across the from one house to another house around the city, and it was an easy way to get around without a lot of traffic. The other thing was you often lived on your roof, especially in the hot summer. You would winnow your grain up there. You would allow your grain to dry. So your roof was also a work area. And as such, you did need a fence around it so you didn't fall off. What happens if a toddler comes up there? What happens if you get unsteady on your feet or there's something slippery? So that fence protected people. Well, most of us, unless we're maybe in a major city, we don't walk on our roofs. We don't work on our roofs. But the principle still remains. If you have a balcony, if you have stairs, you should have a balcony there. You should have some barrier that ensures the safety. So the idea here is negligence. Same thing with a well. If you have an open well, you don't, if it's up above ground where somebody really has to crawl into it, maybe you should put a little cover that you can take on and off. But if it's at ground level where somebody could fall into it, baby Jessica, for those of us that were aware of that, some 30 years ago, it's on the homeowner to make sure that there are not negligent situations. Same thing like a pool. If you have a pool, make sure there's a fence around it. So a lot of these ideas in the Torah are actually incorporated into modern society today because we've evolved. We've learned from our mistakes. And so much of the Torah we actually live in our day-to-day lives for most of the developed Western world. So that is kind of the background that I want you to kind of have in the back of your mind. The Torah is foremost a law. It's black and white. Do this, don't do that. There are statutes that are prescriptive. Do this. There are judgments that deal with the consequences for when those statutes are violated. And remember, each of these statutes will fall under, it's a division. Each of them fall under one of the headings of the Ten Commandments. Everybody wants to look at the Ten Commandments as though they are just, 10 commandments. No, in Hebrew it's davar. They are 10 categories, 10 words, 10 matters, 10 ideas. And the divine law of Moses, because it was divinely revealed to Moses, is what puts it into practical application. It gives teeth to those 10 commandments so that they're not just some high and mighty utopic idea without any real world application. Now, I want to transition a little bit into the idea of the composition of the Torah, because the Torah that we have today is not always in the correct chronological order. Exodus, for the most part, does indeed, as we're going to see today, come before Leviticus and Numbers. But it doesn't mean that the chapters within Exodus are necessarily in chronological order. And to appreciate this, I think we do have to consider the task that was before, I do find great evidence for Ezra and the scribes that were underneath him, the Levitical scribes. The task that they had at hand, it was a daunting task because they probably had between the Torah scrolls, the scrolls of Israel's history, and the record of the wilderness journey, probably just the Torah alone, those 40 years in the wilderness, they probably had 100, 120 scrolls. And they were tasked with taking these various scrolls and reducing them into a single document that encapsulated all of this history. The same thing that they had to do with the annals for the monarchy, as well as the chronicles for the monarchy, two systems of accountability, two systems of witnesses to ancient Israel's history. The other thing that you had to do, you had to incorporate the prophets. Some of these were very minor prophets. So you do find there's a prophet Jehu, there's a prophet Jonah, and some of their prophecies are simply recorded and edited into the books of Kings and Chronicles. So their message isn't lost, it's preserved, but only those things that are timeless, kind of those things that transcend, this specific situation and that might be relevant to future generations, are included in that final record. Another thing to consider is that much of the original scrolls were indeed lost with the burning of the first temple. The temples anciently always served as archive centers. All of your formal, your legal, your state memorials, all of those would have been deposited first in the temple and secondly in your palace. So you would have had your the scribes for your monarchy that were official recorders that would have maintained a record, but then you had a parallel system and a counter system within the Levites that would have performed the same job. It's just that those records would be archived within the temple. So this is kind of the background. Now I want to get into the nitty-gritty. And I find that this is so much fun because Exodus 18, where Jethro comes to Moses and he gives Moses some counsel regarding the structure, the leadership of ancient Israel, is very informative. But unfortunately today, Exodus 18 has been placed way out of place because it probably comes either after Exodus 23, 24, or maybe even after Exodus 34. Somewhere around in there is where Exodus 18 should very likely be given. But that was probably maybe its own account, had its own scroll. So when everything was collapsed together, it could have just been, an issue of space. This is the space I have to write on. Look, I can get this record right here. And that concept of utility trumped the chronological order. We don't know. That is simply one possibility. But what I do want to demonstrate is that the record of Exodus 18 predates Deuteronomy. And we're going to see some of this today where the book of Exodus predates Deuteronomy in at least two cases. So turn with me, if you will, to Deuteronomy 4, verses 12 through 14. And remember, the setting at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20 is that Yahweh spoke audibly to Israel. Israel gets scared. They are petrified and they say, don't talk to us anymore, Yahweh. Let Moses be our intermediary. Let Moses be our intercessor. Speak to him because you're too scary. So what happens? When you go through the chronology of the Exodus, and as well as Shabbatot, which we are several weeks away from Shabbatot, you find that Yahweh spoke to the children of Israel on Shabbatot. That's when he audibly spoke the 10 Commandments to the entire nation. But then you find that there were these 6 days. I call them days of glory because there was this manifestation of Yahweh on the mountain, like with thunders and lightnings. And there were like these 6 days that occurred between the audibly spoken words of Yahweh at Mount Sinai until Moses goes up into the mountains 7 days later. And it is that time that Yahweh breaks down. I mean, this is why I call it the divine law of Moses, because it is there and then that Yahweh takes the utopic 10 Commandments and gives it to Moses in a legal form, in a law code, a structure that's functional for a nation and for a society, so that we're not just left, okay, here's the 10 Commandments. This is what we want to do. This is great. But it actually helps Israel to achieve those goals, to meet those high and mighty ideals within the 10 Commandments, and to do so with ease, to make it very easy. So this is what it states in Deuteronomy 4, verses 12 through 14. And notice that the text here is reflective. In other words, the text is remembering the past. In no way does this text present itself as something that is primary or an original event, but rather it is looking back and remembering a past event as history. So Deuteronomy 4, 12 through 14. Yahweh spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the voice of his words, but you did not see any similitude or image. You heard only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. Again, this is something that you're going to perform. Even the 10 commandments. And he wrote them upon 2 tables of stone. And Yahweh commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments, that you may do them in the land where you go to possess it. So I know one approach is to simply limit the written Torah. And you find this within a lot of Christian sects, where the only thing that they really see as binding or valid today is the 10 Commandments. But this really this is what I call where you just kind of snipe something out of context. It's like you're gonna take your scope, you're gonna look only at this one little text right here, and you're going to exclude everything around it. Personally, I find that to be very intellectually dishonest, and I find it to be something that is coercive, because it only leads to the oppression of people when we use that method. So it allows a priest, a rabbi, a teacher, a scholar to come in, because we don't have those clear defined boundaries. We don't have that specificity. Well, guess what? They can come in and now be the specificity. They're going to teach you. Let me tell you. So they're going to fill in and displace and replace the written Torah. So it's very important that we see that at the same time that Israel receives the 10 Commandments, they hear them. Well, Yahweh has already established Moses is going to go up into the mount for 40 days. And it's during those first 40 days that Yahweh is going to teach him statutes and judgments. So then when we come to Exodus 18, where Jethro comes to Moses and brings Zipporah and his sons to Moses, all of this has already happened. Shavuot has already happened. Moses has already been with Yahweh 40 days and 40 nights before we ever get to Exodus 18. Because, how do we know this? Well, the judgments. Remember in verse 14 it says Yahweh's going to teach him statutes and judgments. Well, the judgments that Moses received with the first advent at Mount Sinai are today recorded in Exodus 21, chapters 21 through 23. And notice how this evidence that the book of Exodus predates Deuteronomy, and that Jethro's coming to Moses also predates all of this, it really undermines the documentary hypothesis. So we're going to kind of wade our waters into that in just a little bit. Now, I want to get more into the philosophy, too, of what happens when Jethro comes to Moses. Because in Exodus chapter 18, we find that the method Moses was originally using after, again, this is after he received the statutes and judgments, and he would rise up early in the morning, he would sit in a judgment seat, and he would hear controversies. Because what do we know about human nature? Barely a day goes by but which we're not offended, or we don't have some sort of conflict with our neighbor. And, it's like having a bunch of children, a bunch of high school students, where they're always fighting. There's always these conflict, and Moses is there resolving it. And as he resolves these conflicts between brother and brother, or sister and sister, it doesn't matter, he's teaching them statutes and judgments. So as he resolves these, he's teaching them the statutes and the judgments that are the precepts governing how they should deal with their affairs, and so they can better resolve these on his own. So look at Exodus 18, verses 15 and 16. This is what it says. And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to inquire of God, when they have a matter, they come to me, and I judge between one and another to make them known the statutes and laws of God. Now remember, Moses didn't have these before he spent those first 40 days and 40 nights at Mount Sinai with Yahweh. So this occurs after that event. But Moses was originally operating underneath the idea of handing out fish. So people would come to him, he'd give them a fish, teach them the laws and the statutes. Everybody had to come to Moses and teach laws and statutes, teach laws and statutes. This is a very inefficient system. It is one that will not be perpetual. When Moses dies, well, how are they going to really retain these statutes and judgments? How is this system of governance, this system, the ideologies, the precepts, the values, how is the Torah going to outlive Moses so that it becomes something that as a covenant blesses and enables a peaceful life and none of these diseases, this test, how is it going to go beyond Moses? So Jethro comes in and he is able to counsel Moses. And what we find in Exodus 18 is that Jethro actually has a lot of wisdom and understanding regarding the law of Yahweh, which we'll get into in a minute. But Jethro teaches Moses something he hadn't considered. Rather than handing out fish all day, Jethro suggests that Moses give the people fishing poles and teach them how to fish. So this distributes responsibility. You have more people that are going to now have charge over the people, and it has accountability. And there's something that happens when that power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a very few, but it is spread throughout society. All of a sudden, that law, that is the law of Moses, it becomes the law of the people. It becomes something that they can relate to. It becomes something that they are responsible for, something that they have to uphold and that they have to have lived to. So that shared responsibility becomes very important. Now, here's the caveat, because it does not appear in any way that this responsibility for upholding and teaching statutes and judgments was solely restricted to the priesthood. Turn to Exodus 18, verse 20. It says, "And you shall teach the statutes and laws, and you shall show them the way wherein they must walk and what they must do." So this was Jethro's counsel. So how does Jethro have the ability to counsel Abraham? Well, we find in Genesis 25, verse 1, that Abraham, other than Sarah, also took concubines. Now, concubines never had the same status as the legal wife. They were not, the man and legal wife were always one unit. No matter where you look in the ancient Near East, when there is polygamy, there's one man, one woman, and any other women brought in are always concubines. They are subservient to the woman in most cases, the head wife, who rules over all the wives in the harem. And the purpose is to produce offspring so that a man's name, his fame, his lineage can exist throughout time until that final event where there is that final redemption and final return. So you find that this is something that's very foremost in the minds of all ancient societies. And Jethro was actually Abraham's great-great-grandson. So in Genesis 25, verse 1, we find that one of Abraham's concubines was Keturah, as she had Midian as a son. We find that Jethro comes from the land of Midian. And in verse 6, it says that, and this is Genesis 25, verse 6, it says that before his death, Abraham sent all of the sons of his concubines to the east. Well, to the east would have been the area of Jordan. It would have been the territory of Esau, as well as the territory of Ishmael. So most of his sons lived within those tribal communities, and Isaac alone retained the authority, the leadership, as well as the inheritance of that of the promised land proper, the land of Canaan. And it's very interesting because we do find two words used for Yithro in the text. We have Yithro, Raguel, or Raul. Raul or Raguel means friend of God, and that was probably his real name. And he was indeed a priest to El. And remember, before Yahweh separated himself from the gods and chose Israel as a nation, most people in Canaan probably knew Yahweh as a El God. We see this with Melchizedek, where Abraham brings tithes and offerings. And originally, God probably preserved some ideology of truth. But over time, man corrupted that. Man began to add all of it, as man does throughout time, his own laws, his own mythology, his own teachings, his own regulations, so that it became entirely corrupt. So corrupt that Yahweh had to call Abraham, set him apart, and sanctify truth within Abraham and his seed. And this is what we see happening. But the name Yithro, however, could be a title because it means excellency, preeminence. So when you see Yithro in the text, just know that it could very well be my Lord or your excellence, according to the dialect of its day, and it is preserved in the text. That is one possibility. Now look at the remembrance, the account in Deuteronomy 1, verses 15 through 17, that is still referring to this event. Moses states in Deuteronomy 1, verses 15 through 17, "So I took the chief of your tribes, wise men and known." And so notice this. Moses is not taking of the Levites per se. Who is he taking? He's taking the chief of the tribes. So we are talking about 11 tribes, 12 tribes, each tribe having its own representative, its own source of authority, where one tribe is not ruling over the other tribes. Okay, so I took of your tribes wise men known, and I made them heads over you, captains of thousands, captains over hundreds, captains over 50s, and captains over 10s, and officers among your tribes. Do you realize how accessible this government was? If you appealed to your representative, who only represented 10 people or maybe 10 families, because it was probably by family clan, and can you imagine, I have an issue, we need to resolve this. You had immediate access. You weren't waiting months and years for some justice, judgment, or crime to be solved. It was immediate because you had that. They were only responsible for 10 people. If he couldn't solve the people, well, it went up the chain of command where, okay, so we're going to go up to the guy who's over 50 people. And if he can't solve it because it's a really hard case, we're going to go to the guy who's over the 100 people. Oh, if he can't solve it, we'll appeal to the thousands. So this is what we find. But notice what this idea that Yithro teaches Moses of giving the leaders, giving their representatives the fishing poles so they know how to fish. In verse 16, this is Deuteronomy 1, verse 16. It says, "And I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother, as well as the ger that dwells among you." Verse 17, "Do not respect persons in judgment. You shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be the face of man. For whose judgment are you issuing? Who are you acting in the stead of? For the judgment is God's. And the case that is too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it." So you have this system that Moses puts in place. It's a rank system of 5 tiers. The first are 10s, 50s, hundreds, thousands. So you have the fifth, fourth, third, second, with the first rank being the high priest. Or even within the family clans, that there could be something that's there working in the family clans. But the highest and the first rank is always going to be the high priest, because he will ultimately decide difficult cases. And this provided for a lot of continuity within society. And it really, could you imagine if we had some sort of system like that in America? It could very likely solve a lot of the issues that we have. And this system, just to put it in a modern context, at the time of the Exodus, Israel was a very small community. Maybe at most you had 600,000 people. If we were to, say, adopt this system in America today, we would probably have greater delineations of these ranked offices. Because our population is so great, we're 350 million people today, we probably need divisions for 10,000 people, 50,000 people, 100,000 people, and maybe even 5,000 people, and maybe even a million people. So as an example, with 350 million people, if we divided this into a system of 500,000, divide the population by 500,000 so that there's some federal representative, it would end up with 350 representatives at that top federal tier that are directly interacting with the priest and then later the monarchy. So again, this just really keeps the system, because it's based on population, it really keeps it in touch with the people when it is followed. Of course, Israel, they always had a tendency to forget their original structures and to create their own instead, and that always led to oppression. We do not know how well these systems integrated under the monarchy. What did they absorb? What did they replace? We do know that some changes were made where those systems, as it states, I believe it's in 1 Chronicles 25, that David and Samuel they definitely restructured the priesthood for function under the monarchy, but they also did so with the tribal leadership, so that the tribal leadership answered to the monarchy as well. So I'm not going to get into that today. If you want to study that on your own, I think I cover that in chapter 7 of Yahweh Exists, if you want to delve into that any deeper. So now I want to come back to the idea of statutes and this idea that they're statutes of life, because that is what is stressed over and over again, whether we look at Ezekiel 33 verse 15, or whether we look at Exodus 25 verses 25 and 26, as well as the different ceremonial regulations that are in the Torah. Now, and it is unfortunate. It doesn't matter modernly if you're in Judaism or in Christianity. It has been my experience through interaction, private discussions, studying with many Jews and rabbis, and discussions with Christians. The ceremonial aspects of the law, those rules and regulations tied to Yahweh's sanctuary, are the ones we denigrate, the ones that we almost hate, the ones that we say are passé, no longer have relevance. But it is those statutes that are directly tied to life that we may live. And by viewing those as something that is archaic, something that is out of date, or something that is, why in the world would you want to do that? We lose that access to life, to peace. God's and Moses, their organization of Israel's government into these increments, it produced life by creating a stable society, by creating direct representation, a system whereby peace could be established. You're not going to live long upon the land when your society devolves into constant controversies and conflict, and there's no accessible path for reconciliation, restoration, for seeking that direct access to judgment and judgment. And, in America today, we talk about the broken system of America, Well, part of that is that our representatives are, so few, given the great population that they're representing. One senator could be representing, a couple million people. What access is that? So yes, Torah produces life. It produces peace when it's followed. It does not concentrate the power into one group. Today all Republicans or all Democrats, or all independents. It disperses it among the 12 tribes, which modernly could be viewed as more powers within the hands of the states. That might be a more modern, if we were to try to watch this or apply it in the United States. But when we look at these statutes, those that are tied to the priesthood are unfortunately the ones today that we don't respect. We don't view them as having value. And because of that, we fail that test. Remember what Exodus says? He gave the waters of Meribah, or Marah, as a test, to test us. And this is what we see. Turn to Leviticus 10, verses 9 through 16. Because what happens, Moses doesn't just establish tribal leaders to teach Israel's people. It appears that all of those tribal representation were on the one side of what maybe today we call civil courts, and they were a direct representation for the people. But you had another system that was a federal system that functioned within the government proper, which were your Levites. So turn to Leviticus 9, verse 16, and notice what this teaches us. So first of all, notice there is a direct black and white law, something that's not changed, something that you have to adhere to. But within that law, there are teachings, philosophies, precepts that we are to learn from it. So Exodus 10, verses 9 through 16. This is an instruction to the Levites. Do not drink wine or strong drink when you and your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation, that you do not die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. So this is one of the Olam statutes, one of the Olam Hak, where it is perpetual. Not some statutes, as we will see, only had application for the wilderness. They were limited. They were restricted for only while Israel dwelt in the wilderness. But often there is a longer term statute that comes out of it. Now, here we have an instruction that when Aaron and his sons go into the tabernacle of the congregation, they're not allowed to drink wine or strong drink. They can't get drunk. Now, why would this be? We have many instances where Moses and Aaron are at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation and they hear Yahweh's voice. And this happens at least 12, 13, 15 times when you read the books of Exodus and Numbers. Well, if you're drunk, your perception is altered. If you have strong drink, if you're under the influence, what happens if you're in an inebriated state? Your mind is altered and you think that God spoke to you when he didn't. That right there, your life is in your hands, because if you say something inaccurately that, oh, Yahweh said to me, and he didn't because you were drunk, you have to be very careful with that. But notice the teaching that comes out of this specific law. So the specific law is don't drink, don't become inebriated, don't become under the influence when you go to the tabernacle. But notice the reason for this. I mean, Yahweh is very generous because many times he gives us the reasons, the precepts behind his instructions. So verse 10, that you may put a difference between holy and unholy, between clean and unclean, that you may teach the children of Israel the statutes which Yahweh has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. So think of this. The Levites very likely directly taught. Now remember, you had 4 Levitical cities in every single tribe. So think of these as county seats. So every single tribe had 4 counties. Every county had 4 county seats where you would have access to Levites. The Levites, both at the Exodus as well as in future generations, would train Israel's representatives. Those representatives of tens, 50s, hundreds, they weren't just out there, deciding on their own. They were taught by state-sanctioned Levites who had and preserved that Torah. But they had been trained by Moses, and they had been trained by Aaron, and that was passed down, and it was very, very tightly protected, so that you didn't have added regulations. You didn't have regulations that were subtracted from it. The sanctity of that authoritative text was maintained distinct from any other prophetic writing, any other document that could arise in later history. And we're going to see that as we go throughout this series. Now, the other thing that we find, the importance also here is that this whole entire system of teaching, you don't want to be inebriated because you want to have a clear mind when judging, but it's to teach between the holy and the unholy, between the clean and the unclean. So you are supposed to distinguish. You are supposed to separate. There is a common, I will say, a common philosophy, a common desire within both Judaism and Christianity that wants to make everything holy. It wants to take the sanctity, and we're going to get into this, not today, but in our next episode a little bit more, that wants to take the sanctity of those things that are specifically set apart for the Levites and distribute it to all society. So that if you follow Torah, if you follow Yahweh, then the things that are specific to the priesthood, maybe it's jealousy, maybe it's envy, we want those things for ourselves when some of those things are clearly restricted. And it actually states those who approach to do the service of Aaron, when you try to take on that high priest function, it's actually a death penalty. That's how well Yahweh insulated and protected that high priest office. So when we take and I'm not going to say all of them, because we are to learn the distinction between holy and unholy. It was the Levites to teach the people's representative how to distinguish between holy and unholy, between clean and unclean, so that we have that judgment ourselves. It wasn't supposed to be, it's just the Levites. It was, again, give them a fishing pole so they can administer their own governance. They can administer their own justice. You were creating a self-sufficient society, one that wasn't necessarily dependent on the priesthood. You only sought the priesthood after you were trained, when controversies existed or arose. And remember, you could always go to your priestly representatives that in your county, for your tribe. And then if you couldn't solve it at your county seat, then yes, it was appealed federally to Jerusalem and to that federal high court with the high priest. So, but it's very important. It teaches us to do a distinction. It's not all the same. There's a distinction between the priesthood and the laity. And no matter how badly you may want it, you can't access that priesthood. You can't do some of the functions, even in later history, that the high priest or the Aaronic priest performed. Yahweh maintains that sanctity and that distinction. Now, there's another thing that we find that is associated with this, and that is that there's a distinction between the holy and the unholy that Yahweh himself brings attention to in Leviticus 18, verses 3 and 5. So turn with me there, because this is where we are going to stop today, is with this concept, because I want to leave the next portion of this study for our next class, because it is there that we get into more of the nitty-gritty of the specific statutes that utterly destroy the concept of the documentary hypothesis and reveal a chronology. It reveals that, oh, well, this text in Exodus was written long before this text in Numbers or Leviticus or Deuteronomy. So by getting into that, it really reaffirms the text, which I want to delve more into next time. But turn to Leviticus 18:3 and 5, because here is where, Leviticus 10, verse 10 states that you're going to put a difference, teaching us to put a difference between the holy and the unholy. Well, here we have an application now in Leviticus 18, verse 3. It says, after the doings of the land of Egypt where you lived, do not do them. And after the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, do not do them. Neither shall you walk according to their customs or statutes. So Yahweh is teaching a distinction between the holy and the unholy. The unholy, the unclean, are the statutes, the customs, the traditions that were followed in the land of Egypt, or even the customs and traditions, the beliefs, the mythology that is adhered to in the land of Canaan. Yahweh is distinguishing himself, and he's saying that my way, in verse 4, my statutes, my judgments, if you keep those, you will live. Walk in those because they are different. So we should see a contrast between the statutes of Canaan, the statutes of Egypt, versus those that are written in Torah. But notice how this teaches. We have these teachings in the law. Never is there this concept that those teachings do away with what is actually written, but they amplify what's written. It makes what is written all the more important and unmalleable. In other words, it's set in stone. You can't get rid of it. You can't add to it. It's right there. But what we do is we apply it. And here Yahweh is teaching us to distinguish. Now notice verse 5, because what did we learn from Ezekiel 33:15? My statutes of life, Exodus, I will put none of these diseases, and Yahweh establishes the statutes as a test. Well, verse 5, it says, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments. If a man do, he shall live by them. I am Yahweh. So it is Yahweh's statutes, which unfortunately our inherited traditions, our inherited systems of belief denigrate. We have been taught, we have been trained, we have been conditioned or gaslit to view these things, because most of what we're going to see is that every single statute in some way deals with the physical structure of Yahweh's sanctuary. It's going to deal with the physical structure because the priesthood is involved. It's going to deal with the physical structure because there are sacrifices involved. And in our next episode, I am going to challenge your preconceived ideas as to what you think the function of sacrifices are and why they're there. And the evidence that I will present from the text may challenge some very, very sacred beliefs that you hold near and dear to your heart, but unfortunately are developed by the traditions of men rather than the written text of Yahweh. So as we return, the promise is that if we will seek Yahweh with all our heart, with all our soul, he's faithful and just, and he will reveal truth to us. And as we proceed along that path, as Isaiah 52 verse 6 states, one day soon, as we do not give up, as we remain faithful and constant in our seeking of him and calling out to him, but guess what? One day he's going to return. He will once again reestablish the knowledge of his name, but more than that, he will send word to us once more. I mean, this is something that is nearing on Israel's future and her horizon. And I mention this because these are topics that I am discussing in my Suffering Servant book that will be coming out, should be out by the end of the summer. I'm just finishing up some of the final edits. But these concepts, the closer we get to that original revealed written law of Yahweh, the better we will be prepared for when God's voice speaks to us once more, for when he sends prophets, people who say, "Thus says Yahweh." When that occurs, we will be ready, and we won't be like the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, who are absolutely terrified and refuse to hear Yahweh's voice, but rather will have a contrite heart, a humble spirit that's willing to obey, willing to follow, despite the fact that it may challenge much of what we have inherited. So the more that we prepare ourselves by returning to the original, by returning to that original way of Yahweh, the more we are going to be prepared for what Yahweh has in store for us very soon in our future. So join me next time. We will be getting into more of the issues with the documentary hypothesis and challenging some of the ideas that we have with the authorship of the text. Thank you so much for joining me from my home to yours. Shalom.